My name is Karen Smith. I'm the Program Coordinator for the Connecting Business Initiative. I'm pleased to welcome you to the CBi Digital Series on Accountability to Affected Populations, better known as AAP, and Protection Against Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, as we know, PSEA, which we're holding today to accommodate participants from different time zones. We had another webinar yesterday afternoon to accommodate the people in North America. This is one of the webinars that CBi plans to conduct as part of our digital series or online orientation sessions with private sector partners. We chose to start with these themes as part of the CBi's commitment to the Interagency Standing Committee, or IASC's 4 non-negotiables, on protection, gender-based violence, accountability to affected populations, and protection against sexual exploitation and abuse, which is also a priority for the Secretary General, as well as the OCHA Undersecretary General Emergency Relief Coordinator. Accountability to affected populations and protection against sexual exploitation and abuse are of core importance to the humanitarian operations. It's through these frameworks and approaches we ensure a positive impact of our operations. The private sector, as a critical part of local communities, is in a key position to ensure proper accountability and protection of the communities in which they operate. At the same time, we understand that the private sector is a great source of best practices, community-led approaches and solutions which can serve as an inspiration to help improve the way we support affected populations. AAP ensures that the most affected people are placed at the core of all our humanitarian programming and activities, while PSEA enables the protection of communities affected by a disaster or a conflict from sexual exploitation and abuse. To support the private sector in AAP and PSEA, CBi has developed draft guidance notes on both, and which we're looking for your input in today, but also we'll be circulating them after the webinar, and we really welcome your comments. So whilst you watch these 2 brief presentations, I would like to ask you to reflect on what support you need from CBi for the private sector to actively engage in AAP and PSE frameworks, as well as engaging in developing solutions. We're going to discuss these ideas through Mentimeter activities, and at the end of the webinar, we'll have a chance for Q&A. Please, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box and we'll address those at the end. Also, I know a lot of companies and organizations have already developed tools, and if you're willing to share those, we'd be quite happy if we can make them anonymous if you wish, to share them with other actors who may not be quite as advanced as you are. So today's sessions will be facilitated by Riza Neri, who is CBi's Network Coordination Specialist, and Maria Contra, who's our Gender Specialist. So without further ado, over to you, Riza.
Thanks a lot, Karen. And hello to our participants, and welcome to those who have just joined. Welcome to the CBi webinar on accountability to affected populations and protection against sexual exploitation and abuse. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And I see familiar names. We have some CBi network representatives here, and thank you to those partners who are also joining us in this call. So again, my name is Riza, and I will be facilitating this session on accountability to affected populations for the private sector. So the next slide will show how we will structure this discussion. As you can see, the overall structure of the session is in terms of answering the what, the why, and the how for accountability to affected populations for the private sector. So we will start with the basic definition of the concept and then move to understanding the need for it. While no one will argue against the need for accountability, the main question is, why is this relevant to the private sector? So I clearly remember how when I was still with the private sector network, I would admittedly get slightly intimidated whenever we had activities with the UN humanitarian country team, and even with local civil society organizations. And we would have discussions on the protection principles, one of which is this accountability. The reason being is that while I understand the need for accountability and inclusion, but how can or will I relate this to how the private sector or the business community operates in the context of business continuation and emergency preparedness and response? And so for the last part of our session today, I'll walk you through CBI's suggested actions on how together we can come up with a shared understanding of what accountability is, accountability to affected populations, and how we can promote this in the humanitarian activities of our organization. So next slide, please. The Interagency Standing Committee, or the IASC, which is an interagency forum that brings both UN and non-UN organizations to enhance and strengthen humanitarian action, defines accountability to affected populations as the active commitment of humanitarian organizations or any organization at that matter to use power responsibly by taking account of, giving account to, and being held to account by the people that these organizations are seeking to assist. So this definition prompts us to understand how private sector actors ensure that affected people have the power to co-design our humanitarian activities. Next, please. So understanding who are the affected people we commit to assist, and by placing them at the center of our decision-making, allows us to adopt a people-centered approach in our emergency preparedness and response activities. So I know that there are tons. There are several literature on participatory approaches, inclusion, and accountability. But the IASC's 3 dimensions of accountability allow for a very straightforward way for us to, number 1, take account of the diversity of the community and equally consider the views and opinions of women, girls, boys, and men from different age groups. Secondly, give account to the people by providing them timely and accurate information in an effective and transparent way across communities. And lastly, being held to account, which means we allow affected people the opportunity to assess the quality of the response of our organizations and asking them how, if these responses are relevant to their needs, to assess how these activities have been implemented, and to provide for them to provide feedback on how well these activities have been addressing their needs. So this framing allows us to reflect how when we use the terms community-based, like in community-based disaster risk management or community-based projects, we acknowledge that communities are not homogeneous entities, and that us in the private sector or private sector actors, we are able to respond to people's needs rather than focusing on what solely the organization can deliver. Next, please. All right. So now that hopefully we have a basic, or rather a better understanding of accountability to affected populations, again, we go back to the question, why the need for it in how private sector engage in emergency preparedness response or humanitarian activities. While there are different drivers, reasons, and barriers to how private sector engages in humanitarian action, we do know that private sector has a critical role in making preparedness, response, and recovery more effective and efficient. So it has been proven, and based on, or as evidenced by the so many great examples from some of the CBi member networks in this call, one thing's for sure, that we now operate in an increasingly complex environment that challenges the current ways we prepare for and respond to humanitarian crises. And these crises demand for fluid collaboration and a common sense of direction amongst different actors. So we have the private sector, the business community, the government, and the humanitarian agencies. So having this shared understanding of what accountability means, it means that private sector gets to assess. Private sector actors get to assess their response objectives and priorities vis-a-vis corporate business continuity objectives. And this is very important. This is an important discussion to have with your colleagues, to have with your fellow executives or members of the network or in the chamber, because this will also help clarify your resources and capacities when you engage in humanitarian activities with the government, with the NDMO, for example, and with other humanitarian agencies as well. Next slide. Now, let's pause here for a quick Mentimeter activity. And to those who have just joined us, thank you for joining the webinar. Let's have this quick Mentimeter activity as part of today's exercise, because this webinar is also a way for us to consult with you to get your inputs on how we would be able to improve CBi's guidance note on accountability to affected populations. So kindly grab your mobile devices, go to www.menti.com and key in the code 84806268. Okay, so again, that's 84806268. Yeah. So let's see, maybe we can go. Okay. So now try to reflect and ask, so within the chamber, within the network, within the business, within the enterprise, who are the most affected people for your organization? Huh? So let's have this word cloud activity today. What do you think are the most, so when we talk about accountability to affected people, who are these affected people for your organization? Yep. Okay, so we have indigent, we have women and children, women, MSMEs, or micro, small, medium enterprises. During our session yesterday, we had people answering women, indigent, and also micro, small, medium enterprises. So it means you can see some similarities here. Okay, so still women and children, persons with disabilities, okay, LGBTQ plus, there you go. We also had a similar answer yesterday. People with disabilities, yeah. So that's why later we will also talk about the use of sex, age, and disability disaggregated data. Okay, so I can see that the MSME word is growing. And again, this makes sense, because if you're a chamber or a network, you would also have a responsibility to the members of your chamber, which would normally be micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. We have the elderly. Okay, great. MSMEs, there you go. It's growing. Women, children. All right. So thank you for sharing your answers with us. Very similar answers to what we also got during our session yesterday. We'll keep the poll open. So try to reflect on your answers as we move forward in this discussion. So thank you. Let's go back to the slide now. So given now your understanding of who are the most affected people when we talk about accountability to affected populations, now we move to the how part, or how can individual companies, businesses, corporate foundations, business chambers, and private sector networks can practice accountability to affected populations, or how to operationalize this. So when we're in the business community, the question is, how do you operationalize this, embed this in your day-to-day or in your daily activities? So the main messaging here is that now we understand what accountability to affected population is, why it's important. Now, how can this be practiced by the private sector? So one would normally see this put into practice by humanitarian agencies through what we call the humanitarian program cycle. But here we classify the activities according to preparedness and response measures, which private sector actors can relate with more easily. So under preparedness measures, you can see that we have here the similar activities that are practiced in the private sector. So we have the usual risk assessment activity, preparedness actions, and contingency planning, which is similar to how business continuity planning is done for enterprises. But for response measures, the activities relate more to when businesses engage in response activities such as conducting rapid damage and needs assessment. So when you coordinate or conduct aid or relief distribution activities and other activities with the intention of assisting your employees and their families, the members of your network, or the bigger community where you operate in for humanitarian purposes. So these suggested actions are part of CBI's guidance note on accountability to affected populations, which we will share with CBI member networks for feedback. Also, these suggested actions have been adapted from the IASC operational framework and the IASC suggested actions to strengthen accountability to affected populations and protection for inter-cluster coordination. Next, now let's go to the suggested actions on accountability to affected populations for emergency preparedness activities. First, on risk assessments. Yep. So when you do your risk assessment, and I do hope that you do your risk assessment and complete your risk registers, expand the hazard and risk identification to consider how your employees and their families, your customers or concession or business area will be affected when we talk about potential risks. So typically, these are or should be included in enterprise risk assessments or for business continuity purposes so that you can assess the risks and the vulnerabilities or weaknesses, yeah, of the enterprise's critical activities and resources. However, as you define the scope of your humanitarian engagement with either other humanitarian agencies or with the government, and these are also considered critical activities, consider expanding the risk assessment that you do to include the risks and vulnerabilities of the bigger community that in which the company, the chamber, or the network operates in. So use your answers during our Mentimeter activity a while ago to guide you with regard to defining who are the most affected people for your organization. Another practical way of introducing a people-centered approach to risk assessment is the use of sex, age, and disability disaggregated data. So we had answers that a while ago that says persons with disabilities as the most affected people. So if you have your existing risk assessments or risk registers, start bit by bit. So with components that include assessing hazards or in risks to people, and start checking how if you factor in sex, age, and disability disaggregated data, how these data can help deepen or enrich your existing risk assessment. And acknowledging that not all organizations actually have complete data on this. So for disability disaggregated data, see if you can reach out to other partner agencies like local government, non-government organizations, or civil society orgs who might already have this data and benchmark with them when it comes to reporting templates and mechanisms. Now, next on minimum preparedness actions, we focus on information provision. And here, private sector actors can consider building a directory of community focal points. So we call them community focal points or community partners, and actively involve them in your exercises and scenario planning. So one of the professional practices and one of really the beauty of business continuity planning requires external coordination with different agencies. So the government, humanitarian agencies, emergency response agencies. But here, we are explicitly promoting the engagement of community partners. So, for example, if you are a water utility company that operates a reservoir, include the local village partners when you exercise your flood early warning systems for the facility, and make sure that they play an active role in enhancing your annual exercise programs. So, for corporate foundations, business chambers, and private sector networks, consider also outlining in your crisis communication strategies how you will be able to provide timely and accurate information for affected people. So again, going back to your answers in our Mentimeter activity a while ago, develop key messages and identify appropriate local means of communicating life-saving information. So be it in the local language, in language that they will understand better. So develop those key messages and identify ways how you can communicate these life-saving information to them in a timely and accurate manner. And lastly, on participatory approaches in contingency planning. So we go back to the recommendation of building a common understanding of affected people in line with the mandate of your company, the corporate foundation, the local business chamber, or the private sector network. So this will help in determining your response objectives and also clarify the scope of your humanitarian activities. Because we need to admit that resources are limited, right? So it also has a practical application when you clarify or define who are the affected people for your organization, for the network, or for the chamber. So in business continuity language, this will also help clarify your recovery time objectives, as well as what are the critical services that you need to perform as an enterprise or as a chamber or as a network in order to serve the bigger community in which you operate in. So include also external coordination with your community focal points or partners. So include this in your business continuity and crisis management plans. Consider making this explicitly mentioned in your business continuity strategies and also crisis management structures. Because normally we would see this done in practice, but do consider making this very explicit in particularly in the way you draw your crisis management structures and incident reporting mechanisms. Next, now, so we talked about preparedness. Now let's go to suggested actions on accountability to affected populations for emergency response. So again, in terms of context, the assumption here is that the company, corporate foundation, the business chamber, or the private sector network now engages in response activities. So this will range from the conduct of needs assessment and analysis, planning for response, to actual mobilization of resources for and response monitoring. So the clustering that you will see here covers the wide range of response activities that private sector participates in, and these might be very familiar with you. So these are the activities that you do for response, both for business continuation and also for humanitarian purposes. But firstly, on needs assessment. To be honest, needs assessment can sometimes be very overwhelming, but this is an important first step in determining how will your organization respond to the needs of affected people. So consider coming up with a needs assessment questionnaire. Yeah, a questionnaire that includes questions or a checklist to help identify, number one, information needs. Next, existing local capacity of the community that we are assisting. So understanding that the community already has been doing um, disaster preparedness training prior to the event. So what's the local capacity of the community prior to the disaster event, and building on those local capacities? Also consider protection concerns. So meaning, how do we ensure provision of basic needs with respect to the dignity and well-being of those affected? So remember, if we're dealing with persons or we're working with persons with disabilities, with women, with if the affected people that you have envisioned for the organization that you will see that you seek that you commit to assist involves LGBTQA, QIA. So take into account the diverse needs of the group of the community members that we are seeking to assist. What are their preferred solutions to their needs and their preferred ways to provide feedback and complaints, particularly when it comes to thinking about feedback and complaints mechanisms. So very specific ways that they can provide their feedback and their inputs and complaints. Also make sure to validate the results of the needs assessment through these feedback and complaints mechanisms. Now, on response planning, the next one, include as part of the corporate or the chamber or the network's crisis communication strategies, a communications plan for sharing information and disseminating messages on what has been delivered in terms of assistance and what are the next steps. So consider as well the accessibility of these communication channels. So for example, if you're quite active in terms of social media, if you're doing your information, if you announce what your activities, the network activities or the chamber activities via social media, consider that not everyone has access to the internet. Yeah. So also include information on what has been done, on the complaints and feedbacks that you have received. And actually, the IASC Accountability and Inclusion Portal, resources portal is a good place to check on how other agencies are doing this, particularly good practices and complaints and feedback mechanisms. Yesterday, during our session, there were a bit of sharing in terms of what is being done by the different networks. So it'd be good to also hear from you that maybe you already have these community-led solutions, how you, for example, if you already have a dedicated hotline where the people that you work with can actually access and provide feedback on the assistance or the services and interventions that you provide to them. Now, lastly, on resource mobilization, whenever relevant and possible, consider forming a distribution committee and or a task group or a working group that includes local community representatives or your community focal points. And on response monitoring, make sure to invite local community representatives and focal points to take part in the monitoring process of the activities that you have conducted. So it's all about continual improvement and making sure that they are, or the community, our community focal points, the people, the most affected people that you work with are a part of the monitoring process as well to continually improve the programs and activities that we conduct. All right, so let's go to the next Mentimeter activity. Now, after hearing the suggested actions, we want to hear from you. Yeah, we acknowledge that there are probably tons of good practices that are being done by the network, by your chamber, by your organizations. So please go to menti.com. So using the same code 88432525, can you share with us what other suggested actions do you think we should consider, include in our guidance note to promote accountability to affected populations? So having heard the suggested actions for preparedness and response. So what do you think? What are we missing here? What other good practices that you're doing that maybe we can include as part of the guidance note or checklist? Yeah. Let's see. So what other suggested actions? What do you think should we consider more? So someone said, I think the steps are comprehensive enough. Yeah. And don't worry, we will provide you the checklist or the guidance note so that you can also provide your feedback from there. What do you think are we missing? Anything? Any examples of good practices that your organization, your network is already doing? Uh-huh. So I think it says here, okay, seems like it's comprehensive enough, and it's a lot to digest at the moment. Yep. And actually, if you do have any questions or you want to share additional examples, you can type in the chat and we can continue the discussion further. But I see that there's only one person in the Mentimeter activity, but let's see. So we have hotlines for communities, that's correct. Uh-huh. So speaking of hotlines, so yesterday we had a similar answer, hotlines for communities. So consider, like, when you talk about hotlines, how is it going to be? Will it be in a form of a call center, or a person, a dedicated focal or person from the organization who would be able to address and answer or address concerns or complaints or feedback from the community partners that you work with? All right. Okay, I know it's a lot to digest, but thank you for your answers. Maybe we can go back to the slides. And in terms of helping us better expand our understanding on accountability to affected populations, I leave you with the key resources on accountability to affected populations, which include the IASC Accountability and Inclusion Resources Portal. And this is it's like the online resource hub, the go-to place for people who would want to understand more about the topic. And then for countries, particularly in Asia Pacific, where right now we're still technically we're preparing for hurricane or typhoon season. So now is really the time for you to take a look at the needs assessment questionnaire that you currently have, and visit the menu of accountability to affected populations for with their related questions for multi-sector needs assessment. So this is a good reference as well for you to take a look at how you can further improve your needs assessment questionnaire. We will also post a link to this video on the importance of community engagement during a crisis. So we had our webinar on community engagement last year, and this video is a good reminder of why the need to communicate with the communities that we work with, particularly when we want to address or respond to their needs better. And of course, there's a link to the core humanitarian standards, which set out the 9 commitments that organizations and individuals involved in humanitarian response can use to improve the quality and effectiveness of the assistance that we provide. I remember that there were previous discussions on whether the core humanitarian standards can be applicable to the private sector, just as the SPHERE standards were applied to the private sector. So take a look. It's always a good reference to see if it will help you deepen or enrich the emergency preparedness and response activities. So that ends my session on accountability to affected populations. I hand this over now, the session, to Maria Contro for protection against sexual exploitation and abuse.
Thank you, Risa. Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Contro, and I'm a CBi gender specialist. I will be facilitating the session on protection against sexual exploitation and abuse, PSEA. So this session for the private sector is based on the Interagency Standing Committee methodology adapted for the private sector. So first of all, please make sure that you are participating to the training in an environment where you feel comfortable discussing the topic. If you feel uncomfortable about discussing a topic, it is also completely okay to only listen. And for an environment, for a good environment, please remain open and neutral to colleagues' comments to avoiding any negative reactions or shocks towards anything that participants might share. So let's go to what is protection against sexual exploitation and abuse, PSEA. PSEA supports the vision of humanitarian environment in which people caught up in crisis feel safe and respected, and in which workers themselves feel supported, respected, and empowered to deliver such assistance in working environments free from sexual harassment. PSEA is a responsibility of all actors and workers engaged in disaster management. So what is the private sector role in protection against sexual exploitation and abuse? So private sector is in key position to ensure protection measures and protection of communities in which they operate, since they operate in most of communities. Sexual exploitation and abuse in humanitarian context constitutes acts of gross misconduct and are grave violations of rights of people affected by crisis and of the responsibility to do no harm. It is also a serious reputational damage to the entity whose staff is involved in such acts, including for its partners. So if we look at the protect, respect, and remedy framework, it states that the state duty is to protect against human rights abuses by third parties, while the corporate responsibility is to respect human rights. So PSEA also enables, with the protection measures, it enables to meet these goals. And PSEA is recommended to be meaningfully addressed at the decision-making level of each company as a cross-cutting issue in operations, and to be informed to all staff of all levels. I also wanted to mention the specific situation of COVID-19, since the disruption to livelihoods, public services, and the freedom of movement can increase sexual exploitation and abuse risks for already vulnerable populations. The use of isolation measures may limit access to information on protection against sexual exploitation and abuse, and restrict the access of the victims to reporting channels. So it is core importance, especially in these situations, as well as in many other situations. So the crisis does not create new responsibilities. Rather, the COVID-19 situation should strengthen the existing protection commitments. So let's then see what is it about through a case study. So we will next watch a short video. While it is likely that the private sector member networks are not directly involved in the field level operations, but the staff of the private sector companies are. It is therefore important to ensure that these messages reach all staff involved in humanitarian operations, including employees, subcontractors, and other actors. So let's then go to the video, to the case study.
This funny and handsome young man laughing with a group of friends is Abel, a relief distribution officer working for a local NGO. The NGO that Abel works for is a UN partner organization that recently opened a reception center next to Abel's village. Abel is known as a very caring young man, as he's always trying to give back to others what life has given to him. At work, he's very caring and professional with the beneficiaries. The young lady he's saying hello to is one of them. Her name is Afrida. She's a 17-year-old girl living on her own near the reception center. Like everyone else here, she thinks Abel is really friendly. She's very shy, but eventually finds the courage to say hello to him for the first time. But probably not the last time. Despite this new friendship with Abel, Afrida feels lonelier every day. She's completely dependent on humanitarian support and she hates her life here. Her closest friend, Lara, convinces her that the only way to have a better life would be to become Abel's special friend. As an NGO staff member, he could surely provide her with some extra resources and maybe even help her move to another country where she could start a new life. She could even go back to school and become a famous painter. Even though Afrida doesn't feel comfortable with Lara's suggestion, she doesn't see any other way out. So one day, she decides to meet Abel at his house. She feels very nervous and confused. Abel is surprised to see her here, but decides to invite her in. After chatting for a bit, she finally tells Abel that if he provides her with some extra services and support, she would be willing to sleep with him. Abel doesn't know what to think. He would have never expected his friend to act this way. But Afrida insists. She's a good-looking young girl. Maybe a bit too young. But in Abel's village, girls of her age would be married already. No, maybe he shouldn't. Abel vaguely remembers a training at work on preventing sexual exploitation and abuse. Unfortunately, he has forgotten the details since he did not think the training was important at the time. He believes that the rules probably don't apply to him anyway because he works for a local organization. And Afrida is the one who showed interest in him first, after all. And they both really like each other. Why wouldn't he help her anyway? The next day, Abel tells his colleague Faustin what happened. Faustin doesn't feel comfortable with the story. He's not sure if Abel has acted inappropriately. It was a consensual encounter, he thinks. In the meantime, Abel and Afrida continue to meet in the evenings at Abel's house. Faustin soon learns that Afrida is only 17 years old. This is against the rules of their organization, which forbids sexual relations with anyone under 18 years old, no matter what the legal age of consent of the country is. Speaking with Lara, he also discovers that Afrida hopes to use this sexual relationship to gain access to more services or even move to another country. Faustin feels that Abel needs to put an end to these encounters. What if the community finds out about the affair? What if Afrida gets pregnant? This won't look good for the organization. Also, will Abel get in trouble? There is too much that could go wrong here. Faustin tells his colleague to either stop meeting with Afrida or to formalize their relationship by getting married as soon as possible. Beyond that, Faustin is not sure what else he can or should do, so he decides not to take further action. I have already voiced my concerns to Abel. What he does now is up to him.
Now, after watching the video, let's analyze a little bit. You will soon see a question on your screen and options to answer. You can choose which one you consider is the right answer. So first, who is the victim? So everyone can participate, and please do participate. Who do you consider is the victim in this story? Let's wait a little bit more. I see answers coming in. I think everyone has had time now to, oh, no, still we have more answers. That's excellent. If you haven't voted yet, please do provide your answer through the question on your screen. Who is the victim? Okay, I think we could go to the results then. So who is the victim? Most of you think that Afrida is the victim, but also some said Abel. Let's go to the next question. Who holds power over the victim? So there are different power structures present in different situations. Let's see, for this particular case study, for this story, who holds power over the victim? Excellent. Good to see you are answering the question. Let's wait just a few more seconds, and as it is a question that might require a little bit of analysis. So I think almost everyone have answered now. So let's see the results. Who holds power over the victim? Most of you say that Abel, and some also say Afrida. Let's go to the last question. Is there any misconduct involved in the story? What do you think? If there was any misconduct involved in the story? Options are either yes, no, I am not sure, or that it is complex. And let's wait a few more seconds so everyone has had the possibility to participate. Most of you have already provided your answers, so if you have not, please do so in the next few seconds. Okay, I think we have all the answers. So is there any misconduct involved in the story? Half of you say that yes, there is, and half of you say that it is complex. Thank you very much for your answers and for participating. Let's then go to the continue with the case study analysis, and let's start discussing what happened in the story, demystifying the position and actions of each actor in the story. Afrida holds limited power of the situation, and she is the victim. Abel is in a position of power. He has a status of a relief worker with responsibilities. He has power to say no. However, he has sex with a beneficiary and a minor, and assumably is providing more services in exchange for sex. Lara, the friend of Afrida, has peer influence here. She pushes her friend to offer sex in exchange of additional services. And Faustin is also in a position of power. He has a status of a relief worker. He has power and obligation to report misconduct. However, he wants to solve the issue alone. This connects us to the 6 core principles relating to sexual exploitation and abuse. So here are the 6 core principles. Let's briefly go through them. The first one is zero tolerance policy. The second one is no sex with children, and here meaning people under 18 years old. The third one is that exchange of money, employment, goods or services for sex is prohibited. And the fourth one, any sexual relationship with beneficiaries that involves improper use of power is prohibited. The fifth one, all actors part in humanitarian operations need to report any concern regarding sexual exploitation and abuse by fellow workers. And the sixth one, the humanitarian actors, including all actors, the private sector, and all actors are encouraged to create and maintain an environment which prevents sexual exploitation and abuse. These are the 6 core principles of protection against sexual exploitation and abuse. It is very important to consider the victim's experience. There is visible harm and there is an invisible harm that can have long-lasting consequences to the person and to the community. Therefore, prevention and protection measures are extremely important. So what actions should have the characters taken in this situation? Let's look first at Abel. The possible actions would have been to say no to Afrida, and the possible impact of this would have been not committing sexual exploitation and abuse. For Lara, the possible actions should have been not push her friend, and in case she is not, she doesn't know, she could have asked for support or advice. The possible impact of this would have been Abel not having an opportunity to take advantage of Afrida. For Faustin, the possible actions would have been to report, and the possible impact of this would have been disciplinary measures for Abel. Reporting and disciplinary measures prevent future cases as well. So the core importance is, if you see something, say something. A key to do this is also to partner with humanitarian actors at the national level. And the guidance tool draft will provide more details on how to identify suitable contacts to work in cooperation on the matter. So speaking of the guidance tool draft, as we know that the role of the private sector is essential in finding solutions to stop sexual exploitation and abuse, and there are several good practices on protection measures already in place, also by the private sector. In the guidance note, we present one of these protection measures, and I would like to here present the overall content of the guidance notes, and later after that to discuss with you on what you think is relevant, is something missing, is something needed to be modified for the private sector. So we have developed this guidance note draft on the protection of sexual exploitation and abuse for the private sector. And here is the contents. So we have the 6 core principles of PSEA that we had a look on those principles. Then we have the specific situation of COVID-19. We have a case example how the protection measures have been implemented in practice. We have list of resources at the national level, how to connect with partners for PSEA. And further materials for training purposes, as we remember that it is very important that all staff are aware of protection against sexual exploitation and abuse. So it is important to organize trainings and share information. And we also have how to report sexual exploitation and abuse, these instructions and guidance in the guidance note draft. Then let's look briefly on the key points to consider, as we do want to provide key considerations of what the private sector can do. So for the private sector to help with the protection measures at the country level, they can improve accountability, ensure safe and accessible reporting channels, and if needed, provide correct information to victims for assistance. So the key considerations that we are proposing in this guidance note are divided in three different sections. The first one is to influence through a company policy. So here we propose to consider PSEA as part of the company policy to include the protection measures to company codes of conduct and in general contract conditions for staff and subcontractors or suppliers. Once that is in place, let's go to the education and reporting aspect. So here, consider to designate a protection focal point at your company and to establish a company reporting channel. The third one is to consider strengthening the information on protection against sexual exploitation and abuse for the company staff involved in disaster operations. More details of this are in the guidance note that we will share the draft with you. And consider to strengthen the awareness of all staff members on their obligation to report. Then consider strengthening the communication between the company and external partners, such as the government, civil society, UN agencies, regarding commitments on PSEA. And consider establishing or strengthening the internal investigation procedures. On the third category, lend unique business capacities to fight against sexual exploitation and abuse. So businesses operate in different sectors and they all have unique business capacities. For example, businesses that work in communication can then work with protection against sexual exploitation and abuse through communication. So there are unique business capacities. All sectors are important, and all capacities do provide an important steps in protection against sexual exploitation and abuse. In addition to this, what is relevant to all is to consider strengthening the availability of information on existing services to the victims. So these are the proposed key points to consider for the private sector. Now we would like to ask your opinion. So let's go to the last Mentimeter activity. So please take your phone and you will have in the Mentimeter website as you are logged in, or if you are not logged in, you can still access menti.com, and the code is here 84806268. So please do start typing your answer, what do you consider is already in place at your company or at your private sector network or in your disaster management operations? What kind of protection measures are already in place? So these are part of the good experiences that we would like to hear from you and learn from you. Good, we start receiving answers. Grievance mechanism for sexual harassment in the workplace. Very good. And it doesn't need to be connected to these actions that were just mentioned now. They can be any actions related to protection, prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. So any good practices that are already in place at your company, at your network, or also the good practices that you have, that you are familiar with. So let's give a few more seconds. If no more answers, we can go to the next question. So we would like to ask your opinion. Would you have any comments or improvements for the guidance note for it to be more useful for the private sector? So we would very much like to hear your opinion here. Do you consider that the proposed key considerations are relevant for the private sector? Is something missing? What should be added? Is any of the key considerations such that need to be modified, maybe to be more practical? Or in general, what kind of support is needed? You can also highlight the key support needs that you would like to cooperate with. So let's wait a little bit more, as I know it takes time to type as well.
We'll also be sharing the draft guidance notes after the webinar. So if you need to discuss it with your colleagues first, we welcome your written inputs when it's convenient for you as well.
That is very true. Thank you. So we will be sharing the draft guidance notes, and we hope to receive your comments, your inputs, your suggestions to the draft guidance notes of what you and your colleagues consider relevant for improvements. And based on these inputs, we will then finalize the drafts. So then let's move forward to the next steps. This will be presented by Risa.
Thanks a lot, Maria, and thanks everyone. Thank you for your inputs and active participation. So for the next steps for both the accountability to affected populations and protection against sexual exploitation and abuse, the CBi team will make ourselves available to support member networks who are interested to take these themes forward within the network, within the chamber, with the members, and with your partners. So we know that this can be a bit, this is a lot. So you have accountability to affected populations, and then you have protection against sexual exploitation and abuse. But this is the first step. And again, I remember and I reflect because I came from a private sector network. I came from the corporate world myself. It takes time for us to also understand the practicality of these concepts. So we'll make ourselves available if you think that you'd want to have this kind of orientation or this mini webinar or discussion or whatever activities you'd want to have to move these themes forward. So like what we said, the guidance notes or the suggested actions will share this with the CBi member networks, and we will we welcome your feedback or your input. So it would be great if you can provide us your feedback by Friday, April 23rd. So we will do that at the end of this webinar. And we will continue to consult with you bilaterally with the CBi member networks as to what support you might need to convey this in order to convey this to your members and other private sector partners. And if, like what I mentioned, if you think that this is something that you'd want to expound on further to build capacity and awareness, we'll make ourselves available. For those who are, and thank you to those who joined us today who are not part of the CBi family yet, to our partners here. If you think that this is also an area that you'd want to discuss or further explore, feel free to reach out to the CBi Secretariat as well. So there. So those are the next steps. We can entertain questions or clarifications if you have any. If none, yeah, feel free. Or maybe we can also, if you have any questions from your end or clarifications.
And just to say, thanks both to Riza and Maria. Unfortunately, protection issues still continue to occur in disaster situations. As recently as last week, there were some identified in Democratic Republic of Congo. And we say in the humanitarian community is if you see something, say something. So I guess my question to all of you, if you're delivering aid, if you hear things in the community, if your staff or network colleagues observe something that they think might be inappropriate in a response situation or elsewhere, or if they hear rumors, do they know who to talk to, right? In a simple, that it can be investigated. And so there are frameworks at the country level. We can also help to introduce you to different agencies to help you understand this better and understand how it's being addressed in your respective countries. But I think, the private sector, because you're such an essential part of the community, you're bound to hear things that probably international workers aren't going to hear. And so you can be a really key part of developing solutions for trying to prevent this from happening, essentially. They're open to questions either now or after the webinar.
Absolutely, yeah. All right, I think if they do have questions, they can reach out to the Secretariat and feel free to get in touch with us if you think that you have further clarifications or something that you'd want to expound more in these areas. So last year we started with community engagement, so which is also a very interesting theme. So bit by bit, let's start. And I guess the key message here is how do we make it practical, even for business chambers, corporate foundations, private sector networks, and member companies, and even at the enterprise level. So feel free to get in touch with us. And with that, I hand it over to Karen to formally close today's session.
Thanks very much, Riza. Thanks everybody for taking the time today. We really appreciate it. I know that you have numerous priorities right now, particularly under COVID-19. But we really appreciate you considering this. If you have examples of things that you've set up in your companies or your networks, we'd be really grateful if you could also share those. you know, the humanitarian communities has been discussing this for years and years. So, you know, these are initial first steps. We'd really appreciate, this is a discussion moving forward. This is just a first step of how we can start to look at this and how we can stop, you know, improve AAP and also prevent PSEA in the communities, in the countries, your own countries. So thanks for taking the time. I hope you have a wonderful day. And until our next webinar, please let us know if you have any questions or observations. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you.